Is this some kind of joke? The voice, sharp and laced with the biting arrogance of a young hotshot officer, cut through the humid, stale air like a knife. Lieutenant Commander Thorne, his pristine white uniform already stained with the ghost of a sweat map, glared from behind a bank of silent monitors. His question wasn't aimed at a subordinate or a colleague. It was aimed at a ghost. Standing quietly near the colossal, lifeless main turbine was a figure who seemed to defy the entire modern world of naval engineering. He was old, maybe 70, with hands stained by a lifetime of grease and oil. He wore simple, dark blue overalls, a stark, almost defiant contrast to the crisp white uniforms of the dozen or so frustrated engineers who now stood idle, their faces a mix of professional failure and thinly veiled amusement. This was James Vance, a name that to them meant absolutely nothing. He simply stood, his gaze fixed not on the hostile officer, but on the silent steel beast before them. His calm was an island of tranquility in a sea of rising panic. For 48 agonizing hours, the USS Vigilance, one of the Navy's most formidable aircraft carriers, had been dead in the water. A catastrophic failure in the primary propulsion system had silenced its mighty heart, leaving it a sitting duck in the vast, indifferent expanse of the Pacific. Elite engineering teams had been flown in. They had run diagnostics until the computers threatened to melt down and followed every procedure in the manual, then followed them again, letter for letter. Nothing. The ship, a floating city of 5,000 souls and billions of dollars in taxpayer money, was a monument to modern technology, and it was broken. Lieutenant Commander Thorne, as the chief engineer, felt the immense pressure of this failure pressing down on him. He was the golden boy of the new Navy, a prodigy of simulations and advanced degrees. He understood fluid dynamics and nuclear-powered steam generation on a theoretical level that was second to none. But the engines wouldn't start. And now this relic. "I asked you a question," Thorne snapped, stepping down from the control platform. The metallic clang of his boots echoed in the tense silence. "Who the hell are you, and what are you doing in my engine room?" Jim Vance didn't turn. He just listened. To the silence. To the faint, almost imperceptible groans of a cooling system under strain. To the low hum of the emergency diesel generators, a pathetic substitute for the roar of the main engines. The younger engineers exchanged smirks. Thorne's frustration was their entertainment. "He's with me," a voice grumbled from the hatchway. Rear Admiral Pike stood there, his face grim, his uniform immaculate, but his eyes weary. He had made the call, a call that had been met with disbelief and quiet ridicule among his staff. A call to a retired Master Chief Petty Officer living a quiet life somewhere in coastal Maine. Thorne straightened instantly, his hostility shifting to a more formal, if still resentful, posture. "Admiral, with all due respect, this is a highly restricted area. We are dealing with a critical failure on a nuclear-powered vessel. We have the best engineers in the fleet working on it. We don't have time for visitors." His gaze flicked dismissively toward the old man in overalls. Pike's eyes narrowed. "The best engineers in the fleet have had 2 days, Commander. The ship is still a barge. Master Chief Vance is here at my request." The title, Master Chief, tasted like ash in Thorne's mouth. An enlisted man. An old one. He couldn't hide his disdain. "Admiral, his service records must be decades old. The technology has evolved. We're dealing with integrated digital control systems, not steam gauges and levers." "And yet the levers you're pulling aren't working," Pike retorted, his voice dangerously low. The Admiral's public rebuke hung in the air, thick and heavy. The smirks on the faces of the junior officers vanished, replaced by a tense focus on their consoles. Thorne's face flushed a deep, angry red. He felt the sting of humiliation, not just from his superior, but from the silent judgment of the old man who still hadn't bothered to look at him. Finally, Jim Vance moved. He ran a worn, calloused hand along a thick conduit, his touch gentle, almost reverent. It was the gesture of a musician tuning an instrument, not an engineer inspecting a machine. His eyes scanned the labyrinth of pipes and machinery, not with the analytical gaze of a technician, but with the holistic view of an artist seeing a complete picture. He paused, his eyes landing on a small, seemingly insignificant auxiliary valve assembly tucked away behind a larger coolant pipe. It was a piece of equipment deemed non-critical by the modern diagnostic systems, a relic of an older design philosophy that prioritized manual overrides and backups. Jim reached into the deep pocket of his overalls and pulled out a simple tool. It wasn't a sophisticated electronic device. It was a machinist's stethoscope, its metal bell tarnished with age, the rubber tubing cracked and worn. He placed the bell against the valve housing, closed his eyes, and listened. A few of the younger engineers couldn't suppress a quiet snort of laughter. It was absurd. It was primitive. Thorne folded his arms across his chest, a look of pure, unadulterated contempt on his face. He was allowing this farce to play out only because the Admiral was present. He would have this old man escorted out and logged as a security breach the moment Pike was gone. But as Vance listened, his expression changed. It was a subtle shift, a tightening around the eyes, a slight furrow of his brow, a flicker of a memory, a ghost in the machine. Unseen by the senior officers, a young petty officer, a woman named Chen, stood by a secondary communications panel. She had been watching the entire exchange, her initial amusement turning to a growing sense of unease. She had seen the way the old man touched the machinery, the look in his eyes. It wasn't the look of a confused old-timer. It was the look of a man who was seeing something they were all missing. She had also seen the undisguised contempt on her superior's face. She knew Lieutenant Commander Thorne. She knew his arrogance, his absolute faith in his own modern training, and his dismissal of anyone who didn't fit his mold. She had heard the whispers about who the old man might be. A legend, a ghost from the old Navy, a man they called the Engine Whisperer. This wasn't a technical problem anymore. It was becoming a crisis of leadership. With a deep breath, her fingers flew across the console, typing a discreet message. It wasn't to anyone in the engine room or even to the bridge. It was a direct, encrypted message to the Fleet Admiral's personal aide, a man she had once served under and knew to be a no-nonsense problem solver. The message was simple. Sir, Admiral Pike has brought a civilian, consultant aboard the Vigilance to assess engine failure. Name is James Vance. LCDR Thorne is obstructing. Situation critical. The crew is losing confidence. She hit send just as Thorne's patience finally snapped. Admiral, this has gone on long enough, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. We have protocols to follow. I must insist that this gentleman be removed from the engine room so my team can get back to work. The call had been made. The witness had acted. The pieces were now in motion, far beyond the confines of the silent steel heart of the crippled carrier. Help was coming, but not the kind anyone in that room expected. Inside the quiet, climate-controlled command center at Naval Base Coronado, Fleet Admiral Marcus Thorne, a man whose stern portrait hung in halls of power across the globe, was in the middle of a high-level video conference with the Joint Chiefs. His aide, a young, impeccably professional lieutenant, approached him and placed a tablet quietly on the desk in front of him. The Admiral, a man renowned for his unshakable composure, glanced down at the incoming message. His eyes, accustomed to scanning complex, strategic reports, narrowed slightly as he read the name. James Vance. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. He held up a hand and the four-star general on the main screen immediately stopped speaking. Gentlemen, Admiral Thorne said, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of steel. I have an urgent operational matter to attend to. We will reconvene at 1600. He didn't wait for a reply, ending the conference with a single tap on his screen. He turned to his aide, his expression now one of intense, focused urgency. Get me Admiral Pike on the Vigilance now, secure channel, and get me a line to the Secretary of the Navy's office. Inform them that I am initiating a personal command intervention. The aide's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. A personal command intervention was a tool of last resort, an action that stripped layers of command and put the fleet admiral himself in direct operational control. It was almost never used. "Sir," the aide began, "the matter on the Vigilance." "The matter on the Vigilance," Admiral Thorne cut in, his voice sharp, "now involves Master Chief James Vance. Do you have any idea who that is?" The aide, a top graduate of the Naval Academy, a man who could recite the specifications of every ship in the fleet, shook his head. "No, sir. His records are classified above my clearance." Admiral Thorne stood, his powerful frame casting a long shadow across the room. "He's the man who wrote the book on these engines, not the manuals you read, Lieutenant. The real book, the one written in sweat and grit and intuition. He's the man they called when the prototypes were failing on the test stand 30 years ago. He's the reason those reactors have a safety record. Now get me that connection." Back on the USS Vigilance, the atmosphere in the engine room had grown even more toxic. Lieutenant Commander Thorne, emboldened by what he saw as the Admiral's inaction, decided to press his advantage. He saw the old man not as a potential savior, but as a scapegoat. "All right, that's it," Thorne announced, stepping directly in front of Jim Vance. "I am the Chief Engineering Officer on this vessel. I am ordering you to cease this performance and vacate my engine room immediately. If you do not comply, I will have you forcibly removed and placed under a guard for interfering with naval operations during a crisis." He turned to two burly security personnel. "Escort this man to the brig." Before Pike could respond, before the guards could make their move, the engine room's main communication speaker crackled to life, bypassing all local controls. The voice that boomed through the space was not that of the ship's captain or the executive officer. It was a voice that every single person in that room recognized instantly. It was the voice of God in the modern Navy. "This is Fleet Admiral Thorne. Who is in command in that engine room?" A wave of shock silenced the compartment. Lieutenant Commander Thorne froze, his face draining of all color. He had just publicly threatened a man in front of his entire department, and now, the highest-ranking officer in the entire fleet was on the line. "Is it true, Lieutenant Commander Thorne," the fleet admiral's voice cut in like a laser, "that you have dismissed the counsel of the most experienced propulsion specialist in the United States Navy, a man I personally credit with saving the lives of over 200 sailors on the USS Kensington?" Stunned silence. The engineers stared at Jim Vance, this quiet old man in greasy overalls, in a completely new light. "That is precisely the problem, Commander. You were not aware, you were arrogant. You let your pride and your faith in digital readouts blind you to the wisdom standing right in front of you. You are hereby relieved of your duties as Chief Engineer. Report to your quarters and await further orders." The communication line went dead, leaving a silence more profound than before. Stripped of his authority and utterly humiliated, Lieutenant Commander Thorne turned and walked stiffly out of the engine room. Jim, seemingly unfazed by the high-level drama, simply turned back to his work. He handed his stethoscope to the young petty officer Chen, who had made the fateful call. "Here," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Listen. Tell me what you hear." She took the instrument, her hands trembling slightly, and placed the bell against the auxiliary valve housing where he had indicated. At first, she heard nothing. Then she caught it, a tiny, almost imperceptible flutter, a high-frequency vibration that didn't belong. It was a sound so faint that the ship's multi-million-dollar acoustic sensors had dismissed it as background noise. "There's a tremor," she whispered, her eyes flying open. Jim nodded slowly. "It's a harmonic resonance. The valve isn't closing completely. It's letting a microscopic amount of steam bypass into the secondary coolant line. Not enough to show up on the pressure gauges, but just enough to throw off the turbine's balance and trigger the automatic shutdown." He then began to give a series of quiet, precise instructions. He didn't shout or bark orders. He spoke with the calm authority of a man who was not guessing, but knew. He had them manually override the digital controls for the auxiliary valve, a procedure that wasn't even in the modern emergency checklists. As they worked, the first of a convoy of helicopters thundered through the sky, dispatched from the nearest naval air station the moment the fleet admiral had hung up. They weren't carrying more engineers or tools. They were carrying the admiral's personal staff, a team of investigators, and a full public affairs contingent. Their destination was the engine room. They arrived just as Jim Vance wiped his hands on a rag and turned to the main control panel where Petty Officer Chen now stood. "All right, young lady," Jim said softly. "Let's bring her back to life. Initiate the startup sequence, slow and steady." Chen took a deep breath, her fingers hovering over the console. She chose to trust the man, not the machine. She began the sequence. For a moment, there was silence. Then a low hum began to build, a sound that grew steadily in pitch and volume. A deep, powerful vibration rolled through the deck, plates. The lights in the engine room flickered once, then burned with a new steady intensity as the main generators kicked in. The roar of the main turbine filled the space, a triumphant, living sound that echoed through the entire ship. The USS Vigilance was alive again. The two-star admiral and his honor guard stepped into the engine room, but they ignored everyone else. They walked directly to Jim Vance, who stood quietly watching the gauges settle. The admiral, a man who commanded his own battle group, came to a halt 2 feet in front of the old man in the greasy overalls. He raised his hand in a sharp, perfect salute. "Master Chief Vance," the admiral's voice boomed, clear and formal. "On behalf of the United States Navy and by order of the Fleet Admiral, I am here to recognize you." The engineers listened, their faces a mixture of shame and awe. They had been in the presence of greatness and had been blind to it. Jim simply nodded, a hint of a smile on his lips. "The ship is fine," he said, his voice calm and forgiving. "That's all that matters. The machine just needed someone to listen to it. Sometimes people do too." The air of mockery was gone, replaced by one of silent, profound respect. The engineers, who had been snickering just minutes before, now watched Jim Vance with a kind of awe. He was no longer just an old man. He was a living piece of naval history, a legend in their midst. As he spoke, another memory surfaced for him, not of a crisis, but of a quiet moment. A young, eager sailor, the very same man who was now Fleet Admiral Thorne, had come to him after the Kensington fire, asking how he knew what to do. Jim had picked up his old machinist's stethoscope, the one he still carried. "This doesn't just let you hear the engine," he had told the young officer. "It forces you to be quiet. It forces you to pay attention to the little things. That's where the real truth usually is." The formal apology from the Navy was swift and public. An official letter was placed in Lieutenant Commander Thorne's permanent file, effectively ending any chance of further promotion. More importantly, a new training mandate was issued fleet-wide. It was called the Vance Protocol, and it required all engineering officers to spend time learning the older manual systems and to study historical case files of failures that were solved by intuition, not just diagnostics. The Navy had learned a critical lesson. Technology is a tool, not a replacement for instinct and experience. A week later, on a quiet street in San Diego, a man in a crisp but undecorated naval uniform was jogging. It was former Lieutenant Commander Thorne. He saw an old man tending to his garden. It was Jim Vance. Thorne stopped, his heart pounding. "Master Chief," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I wanted to apologize. I was arrogant. I was wrong." Jim looked up, his eyes showing no hint of malice or triumph. He snipped a perfect white rose from the bush and offered it over the fence. "The most complicated machines are still just a collection of simple parts. You just have to find the one that's out of tune." Thorne took the rose, its simple beauty a stark contrast to the complex, unyielding machinery he had dedicated his life to. He finally understood that it wasn't about man versus machine. It was about humility. It was about recognizing that true strength often comes in the quietest, most unassuming forms. If this story of quiet heroism and earned respect moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We bring you a new story of incredible human intuition and perseverance every single week. What do you think was the most important lesson from this story? The importance of experience or the danger of arrogance? Let me know in the comments below.